He was about to pull the trigger and earn Nazi Germany's highest honor. Charlie Brown's B-17 was destroyed, one engine dead, tailgunner killed, the crew bleeding out at -60 degrees. Then a German fighter pilot appeared. Franz Stigler needed just one more kill for the Knight's Cross. But when he looked inside that shattered bomber, he didn't see targets, he saw his brother, he saw himself, so Franz made a choice that could have gotten him executed. Instead of shooting, he protected them, escorting the dying bomber across Germany to the sea, and at the coast, he saluted Charlie one last time and vanished. Both men kept this secret for 46 years. But in 1990, they finally met. "I love you, Charlie," Franz said through tears. Two enemies became brothers. They died within 4 months of each other in 2008, proving that even in war's darkest hour, humanity survives. In the frozen Ukrainian village of Berdychiv on a January morning in 1942, SS Obersturmführer Albert Battel stood in the town square with his Luger drawn. Not aimed at the cowering Jewish families huddled against the synagogue wall, but at his own commanding officer, blocking the road with his staff car while his aide Kurt Przemyśl held back a convoy of Wehrmacht trucks, both men having made the split-second decision that would transform them from efficient cogs in the Nazi war machine into something far more dangerous. Men with functioning consciences in a regime that had weaponized their absence. The story of what brought Battel to this moment of crystalline moral clarity, standing between the Gestapo's killing squads and nearly 100 terrified civilians, begins not in the blood-soaked territories of the Eastern Front but in the comfortable bourgeois neighborhoods of Breslau, where Albert Battel had been born in 1891 to a Catholic family of modest means, his father a minor civil servant who had instilled in him the Prussian values of duty and order but also something more subtle and subversive, a belief that law existed to protect the vulnerable, not merely to organize power. Battel had studied law at the University of Breslau, served honorably if unremarkably in the Great War, and returned to practice as an attorney in the turbulent Weimar years, joining the Nazi Party in 1933 not out of ideological fervor but from the same mixture of careerism, nationalism, and naive hope that had captured millions of otherwise decent Germans, who convinced themselves that the party's rhetoric was mere political theater that would moderate once power was secured. He had even joined the SS in 1936, drawn by its elite status and the professional advantages membership conferred, attending the requisite training sessions where instructors with dead eyes and meticulous PowerPoint presentations, had such things existed, would have explained the pseudoscientific racial theories and bureaucratic euphemisms that transformed mass murder into administrative policy. Yet something essential in Battel remained uncolonized by the ideology. Perhaps it was his legal training that made him instinctively recoil from procedures that violated natural justice, or perhaps it was simply that core of human empathy that totalitarian systems work so hard to extinguish but can never quite eliminate in everyone. That stubborn persistence of conscience that flickers like a candle in a cathedral of darkness. By 1941, Battel had been assigned to the Wehrmacht liaison office in Przemyśl, a Polish city near the Soviet border that the Germans had occupied, and it was here that he first witnessed the machinery of the Holocaust in operation. Not the industrial death camps that would come later, but the earlier, more improvised phase of mobile killing units and mass shootings, the Einsatzgruppen and order police battalions that swept through Eastern European towns like locusts, rounding up Jewish populations and marching them to freshly dug pits in nearby forests where machine gun fire would crack the morning air and then fall silent, leaving only the work of burial details and the thin smoke from the farmhouses where the killers would drink vodka and play cards and try not to think about the logistics of evil they had just executed. Battel watched these operations with growing horror, the lawyer in him cataloging the systematic violations of every legal principle he had ever studied, the human in him sickened by the casual cruelty and bureaucratic indifference with which fellow officers discussed their day's work, as if they had been processing customs forms rather than ending lives. He began to use his position to provide protection where he could, forging documents, delaying deportation orders, employing Jewish workers in Wehrmacht facilities where they would be temporarily safe from the killing squads, small acts of resistance that marked him as unreliable in the eyes of more zealous colleagues but were not yet dramatic enough to warrant serious investigation in a system where everyone was looking over their shoulder and personal rivalries could be weaponized through accusations of disloyalty. The turning point came in March 1942 when Battel received intelligence that the Gestapo was planning a major action in Przemyśl. The clinical terminology that disguised the intention to liquidate the Jewish ghetto, transporting thousands to the newly operational Belzec death camp, where they would be murdered within hours of arrival using carbon monoxide, pumped into sealed chambers disguised as shower rooms, the whole operation streamlined with Teutonic efficiency and documented with the same meticulous record-keeping that characterized every other aspect of German administration, as if proper filing systems could somehow sanitize industrial-scale atrocity. Battel knew that under military regulations, he had no authority to interfere with SS operations, that his duty as an officer was to facilitate rather than obstruct, that any intervention would be seen as insubordination at best and treason at worst. Yet he also knew with absolute certainty that if he did nothing, he would be complicit in the destruction of thousands of innocent people whose only crime was their ancestry, people he had come to know by name and face during his time in the city, the shopkeeper who had pressed a bag of hard candies into his hand for the road, the elderly scholar who had taught him Yiddish phrases, the children who played in the narrow streets of the ghetto under the watchful eyes of grandmothers who had survived pogroms and persecutions across 5 centuries of European history, but could not imagine what was coming now because human beings have a blessed psychological inability to truly conceive of their own annihilation until it is upon them. On the morning of the planned action, Battel and his aide Przemyśl commandeered Wehrmacht vehicles and drove to the bridge that connected the ghetto to the rest of the city, the only crossing point that the Gestapo would need to use to transport their victims, and there they established a roadblock, Battel standing with his sidearm drawn and his staff car blocking the road while Przemyśl organized the evacuation of Jewish workers who were employed in Wehrmacht facilities, claiming they were essential labor that could not be spared, a fiction that Battel elevated with official-looking paperwork and the force of his personality, that peculiar charisma that some men possess that makes others instinctively follow their lead even when doing so violates both common sense and direct orders. The Gestapo commander who arrived with his convoy of trucks and armed guards was apoplectic, screaming about insubordination and threatening Battel with immediate arrest and court-martial. But Battel stood his ground with the calm certainty of a man who has decided that some things matter more than survival, and he had timed his intervention perfectly. It was late morning, the senior SS commanders were at a meeting in Krakow, and the Gestapo officer on site lacked the authority to forcibly confront a Wehrmacht officer without triggering an inter-service dispute that might reach all the way to Berlin, where the competing egos of Himmler and the Army High Command were always looking for opportunities to undermine each other. For 6 hours they stood there in a tense standoff that could have erupted into violence at any moment, while Battel evacuated nearly 100 Jewish workers and their families to the relative safety of Wehrmacht barracks, buying them time in a regime where time was the only currency that mattered, each additional day of survival another spin of the roulette wheel that might somehow, against all probability, result in liberation rather than death. The Gestapo eventually forced their way into the ghetto through other routes and carried out their murderous work. Thousands were deported to Belzec and murdered, the streets of Przemyśl ran with blood, the synagogues were burned and the ancient Jewish quarter that had stood for centuries was reduced to rubble and ash within a matter of days. But the 100 or so people that Battel had saved lived through the war, carrying with them the memory of the German officer who had risked everything to give them a chance, who had demonstrated through his actions that even in the heart of darkness it was possible to choose differently, to refuse complicity, to assert that humanity trumped ideology and that following orders was not an excuse but a choice. The repercussions for Battel were swift and severe. He was immediately reported to SS headquarters, investigated by the SD, the SS intelligence service, and subjected to disciplinary proceedings that stopped just short of execution only because he had technically not violated any explicit military order, and because the Wehrmacht was still powerful enough in 1942 to protect its officers from SS vengeance, though this would change as the war progressed and Himmler's empire expanded to encompass ever more aspects of German life. Battel was dismissed from the SS, transferred to a combat unit on the Eastern Front where he was expected to die in the meat grinder of the Soviet counteroffensive, and marked in his personnel file as politically unreliable, a designation that in Nazi Germany was often a death sentence by other means, consigning him to the most dangerous assignments, denying him medical care and leave, ensuring that he would be ground down by the machinery of total war. Yet Battel survived the Eastern Front, living through the horrific battles of 1943 and 1944 that destroyed entire German armies, enduring the lice and dysentery and constant terror of partisan attacks and Soviet artillery barrages, keeping his head down and his mouth shut while all around him the thousand-year Reich crumbled into blood-soaked mud and frozen corpses. He survived to see the Red Army sweep westward in an unstoppable tide of vengeance, survived to witness the collapse of the Nazi state and the revelation of the full extent of its crimes, as the camps were liberated and the world confronted images of skeletal survivors and mountains of corpses and gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, survived to be captured by Soviet forces in 1945 and imprisoned as a former SS officer, subjected to brutal interrogations and years in labor camps where his health deteriorated and his body broke down under the combined weight of malnutrition, disease, and the grinding physical labor that was meant to be both punishment and re-education. He survived even this, repatriated to Germany in 1955 a broken man in his 60s, suffering from multiple chronic illnesses contracted in Soviet captivity, returning to a homeland that barely recognized him and a society trying desperately to forget the recent past, where former Nazis were reintegrating into positions of power and respectability, while the victims of the regime struggled to rebuild shattered lives with minimal assistance or acknowledgement. Battel lived in obscurity and poverty, working odd jobs when his health permitted, watched by suspicious neighbors who knew he had been SS but didn't know or care about his active resistance. Just another gray-faced old man shuffling through the ruins of German cities that were being rebuilt with American money and European labor into the prosperous, democratic society that would become the Federal Republic, the economic miracle that papered over questions of guilt and responsibility with a combination of genuine reform and convenient amnesia. He died in 1952, just 7 years after his release, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of war and imprisonment and the heart condition that had been exacerbated by years of stress and malnutrition, dying alone in a small apartment in West Berlin. His passing noted in a brief death certificate but mourned by no one except perhaps the scattered survivors who remembered the German officer who had stood between them and death on a cold morning in Przemyśl. For decades his story remained unknown, just another footnote lost in the vast archive of World War II testimonies and documents, until some of the people he had saved began to speak publicly about their experiences and specifically named the Wehrmacht officer who had defied orders to protect them, prompting Israeli researchers at Yad Vashem to investigate and eventually, in 1981, nearly 30 years after his death, to recognize Albert Battel as righteous among the nations, one of the tiny number of Germans to receive Israel's highest honor for those who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. His name inscribed in the Garden of the Righteous in Jerusalem alongside other heroes who proved that moral courage was possible even in the most totalitarian circumstances, even when surrounded by a culture of obedience and violence, even when standing up meant almost certain death. The recognition came too late for Battel himself to know that history had vindicated his choice, too late for him to receive the honor and gratitude he deserved, too late to spare him the years of suffering and obscurity that followed his act of defiance. But his story endures as a powerful counter-narrative to the comfortable lie that ordinary people are helpless before totalitarian systems, that following orders is inevitable, that complicity is understandable, and resistance impossible. Battel's life demonstrates that at every stage of the Holocaust there were decision points where individuals could choose differently, that the machinery of genocide required the active or passive cooperation of thousands of people who could have refused or resisted or sabotaged or at minimum declined to participate with such enthusiasm, and that the handful who did resist often paid a terrible price but also preserved their humanity in ways that their more obedient colleagues could never recover. His story raises uncomfortable questions about how many lives might have been saved if more officers had shown similar courage, if more bureaucrats had lost deportation papers, if more train conductors had accidentally left boxcar doors unlocked, if more factory managers had genuinely protected rather than exploited Jewish workers, if more ordinary Germans had hidden refugees or provided false documents or simply refused to cooperate with the machinery of murder rather than persuading themselves that they had no choice, that orders were orders, that their individual actions couldn't make a difference. All the self-serving lies that the comfortable tell themselves to avoid the psychic cost of resistance. Battel's legacy is particularly poignant because he was not a saint or a natural rebel but an ordinary man, a career-focused lawyer who had joined the Nazi Party and the SS for conventional reasons of ambition and belonging, who had absorbed at least some of the propaganda and participated in the system, but who ultimately could not stomach the logical conclusion of the ideology he had casually endorsed, who discovered a limit beyond which he would not go even at enormous personal cost. And this ordinariness makes his story both more inspiring and more tragic, because it suggests that the capacity for moral courage exists in unexpected places, that people can wake up and choose differently even after years of complicity, but also that such Awakenings often come too late and achieve too little, that the 100 people Battel saved were a drop in the ocean compared to the 6 million who were murdered, that his sacrifice, while meaningful to those he rescued and their descendants, could not alter the fundamental trajectory of the Holocaust or prevent the catastrophe that consumed European Jewry. Yet perhaps the point of remembering Albert Battel is not to celebrate a happy ending, because there was no happy ending. He died young and sick and unrecognized. The people he saved were still traumatized survivors of genocide. The Nazi regime still murdered millions, the Holocaust still happened, but rather to insist that even in history's darkest chapters, individuals retain moral agency, that the choice between complicity and resistance exists even when the costs are devastating, that we honor both the victims of atrocity and the complexity of human moral psychology by acknowledging those rare moments when someone looked into the abyss and turned away, when an SS officer drew his weapon not to enforce the regime's murderous orders but to obstruct them, when a man in a black uniform chose to be something other than what that uniform represented, becoming in that moment not a Nazi but simply a human being who would not participate in the murder of innocents and paid for that choice with everything he had, his career and his health and his freedom and ultimately his life, leaving behind only the testimony of survivors and a name on a wall in Jerusalem and the haunting question that echoes across the decades. What would I have done, standing in that frozen square with a drawn weapon and a choice between duty and conscience, between survival and resistance, between the easy path of obedience and the terrible cost of saying no?